of represented students. A significant majority of represented students are young people of color. Most student clients have remained in school, have had their individual educational and related needs addressed in a more effective fashion as a result of SMRLS' representation. And ELAP also helps repair communication and working relationships between school staff, students, and families to address the educational achievement gap. It provides family and community group education services and also partners with nonprofits, such as the Minnesota Organization for Fetal Alcohol Syndrome. Now we have 3 esteemed panelists who are also joining us here. They've spent an endless amount of time on the topic of gifted education. Let's start with Wendy Behrens. Wendy is the Gifted and Talented Education Specialist for the Minnesota Department of Education. She's an author and a consultant, and she's focused on her professional life on creating equitable systems of support for gifted and talented learners. She presents frequently on the identification of underserved populations, acceleration, comprehensive service design, and policies that support gifted and advanced learners. And during her tenure at the state, legislation for gifted and talented education has been enacted to mandate procedures for identification of students and acceleration to better align curricula with students' needs. During her tenure, funding for gifted education has remained stable and restricted to the intended purpose. Wendy's also a founding member of the Educational Insights Group, and that's an international collaboration between researchers conducting a study to develop a better understanding of teacher motivation. Also with us is Dr. Joy Lawson Davis. Dr. Davis is a career educator with a distinguished record of scholarship in the field of gifted and advanced learner programming. Her specific expertise is diversity, access, and equity in programming for students from underrepresented populations and culturally diverse students with multiple exceptionalities. Dr. Davis is also an adjunct professor at Bridges Graduate School for Cognitive Diversity in California and Johns Hopkins University School of Education in Maryland, teaching graduate coursework in cultural diversity and gifted education. And she's also an award-winning author of 6 books, including Bright, Talented Black, A Guide for Families of Black Gifted Learners, Empowering Underrepresented Gifted Students, Perspectives from the Field, and Culturally Responsive Teaching and Gifted Education. And our third panelist is Dr. Scott Peters. Dr. Peters is a senior research scientist with the Center for School and Student Progress at NWEA. Prior to joining NWEA, he served as professor of assessment and research methodology at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater for 13 years. His research focuses on educational assessment and data use, gifted and talented student identification, equity within advanced educational opportunities, and educational policy. And Dr. Peters will be our data guide today. And finally, our co-host here is Lilian Ejebe, and she's going to provide some table setting information before we dive into the Q&A program. She'll also be sharing one of her personal stories. Lilian is a lead attorney of the ELAP project of the Southern Minnesota Regional Legal Services. Lilian has headed ELAP since its inception in 1995. ELAP began as an innovative pilot project to enforce educational insights and improve the education outcomes for low-income and minority students and families who face many systemic barriers. Recently, Ms. Ejebe authored the first of its kind, Children's Education Rights, a handbook for professionals working with Minnesota students. Lilian's longstanding dedication in sustaining this important work has enabled SMRLS to be in the forefront in the area of education law advocacy. She has 4 children, all who went through the Minnesota public education system. Lilian, I'll hand it off to you for this to kind of set the table here. I think you're muted there.
Well, thank you, Sarvesh, for this kind introduction. Thank you so much. And welcome to all of our participants who have joined us today for this very important discussion. I am so thrilled to have the opportunity to discuss this issue, especially as an advocate for children from low-income families. This is an issue that I was introduced to personally many, many years ago. And I have the opportunity, I'm so happy to have the opportunity to shed more light on gifted education. So today I will just give a quick definition of what it means to be gifted and talented according to our state law. And I will hand over some graph for Dr. Peters to discuss the representation. And then I will end by sharing my personal story. So what is gifted education? Sometimes known as the gifted and talented programming, provides unique, challenging educational opportunities or services beyond those presented in the regular education classrooms. And students are identified, can be identified at preschool, elementary, or secondary levels. And those students are those who are capable of or have the potential for high performance. In Minnesota, there is no mandate. I mean, federally, there's no federal mandate for gifted education like we have for special education services. And in Minnesota, there's no mandate that every school district should provide that. But if a school district is providing gifted education, they do have to have identification procedures that are sensitive to underrepresented groups, which includes children from low-income families, English language learners, minority students, and students with disabilities, because students with disabilities can have both a disability and also giftedness in one area or the other. And what is the importance of gifted education? Why do we need to have that for our children? And it's just that in any given classroom, there is a lot of diversity, and that includes that in a classroom, you can have a student's ability in one classroom can span actually maybe between 4 to 7 grade levels. So it is important for those higher performing students to be challenged otherwise, and provided the opportunity for them to further develop their capacity and talent. Otherwise, they will be, those talents will sort of wither away and not be explored some more. And that definitely is not good for our public education system, because we want those children to be a part of that, and that would benefit all children in the classroom. So with regards to the representation of students in gifted education, Dr. Peters, I believe, has a chart that he can discuss with you briefly.
Sure. Thanks, Lilian. So hi, everybody. Scott Peters. Just going to talk you through a figure real quick to give you some idea of what gifted programs look like nationally. This is kind of the only national level snapshot we have of gifted and talented representation. That said, while it's the only data we have, it's also imperfect data for a number of reasons. You'll see it ends in 2018. That's our most recent data collection from the U.S. Office of Civil Rights. And the metric here is a little different, but fairly straightforward. So one would be perfectly proportional representation. So if African-American students were 20% of the nation, we would hope to see them as 20% of gifted programs, or at least something kind of in that ballpark. And 20 divided by 20 is 1. So we would hope to see that line right around 1. Anything above 1 means that group is more represented in the gifted population than they are in the general student population. And under that line would mean a group is less represented and gifted than they are in the overall student population. And just based on what I told you, if you know anything about inequality in the US, you can probably guess which groups are overrepresented and which groups are underrepresented. But here on the figure, you can see the top group up there, Asian American students, the orange line, they're right about twice as represented in gifted populations as they are in the overall K-12 population. That's an especially interesting topic, in the Midwest, because Asian American, just like any of these groups, can look so different. There's different, whether their students are Korean background, whether they're Indian, whether they're Hmong. Our European American or white students are just slightly overrepresented, about 8% more represented in gifted programs than they are in the overall student population. And then our three groups, our largest groups of students of color. So Native students, our Latinx or Latino students, and then African-American students. So African-American students, about half, a little over half is represented as we would expect them to be. Latinx and Native American students, about 3/4 is what we'd expect them to be. And I guess the last thing I'll say about this chart is I've only graphed it back to 2000. We actually have data on this back to about the late 1970s. And the lines look depressingly similar. We've seen very consistent kind of rates of representation for quite some time. If I'm feeling especially positive on a given day, I will think that, well, especially like Latino students, for example, have shown somewhat of an upward trajectory. There are also certain states that are doing better than others, but that's kind of compounded because of the differing state policies that Lilian mentioned. Some states do very strong kind of universal identification, and some, like my home state of Illinois, you know, we're in the Midwest, so we can pick on Illinois a little bit. Illinois has essentially no policies, no funding, no nothing whatsoever. So there's quite a bit of difference in terms of state policy landscape. I guess I lied. I'll say one other thing, which is the Office of Civil Rights does not collect data on socioeconomic status, you know, on any kind of poverty representation, as those are not, you know, suspect classes. We do have some data on socioeconomic representation at the state level and also from national samples. And there is a very strong correlation between socioeconomic status and identification rate. Nationally, something like 2% of the lowest income students, you know, the bottom fifth, are identified. You go to the top fifth, you know, the top 20% of the socioeconomic distribution, you're looking at 12 to 16% of those students are identified as gifted. So pretty big disparities, both in terms of income, kind of class, and also race and ethnicity. And maybe when we get to the Q&A, if people have more questions about that, I'm happy to talk more about it. Oh, I think I'm passing it back to Lilian.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peters. So let me quickly tell my story, because we have all of these experts, and you know, everybody, I'm ready to listen to what they have to say. But quickly, just as a way of background, my story that I'm going to be sharing is a personal experience. As they say, if you see one gifted child, you've only seen one gifted child, and every parent or family has their own story or circumstances. But I'm only sharing this just to highlight that the issue does impact children and families, and that there may be a way to sort of resolve some of the issues that come up. So my daughter was identified in 3rd grade. And back then I wasn't practicing education law. I was a lawyer then, but had no clue about the education rights of children or even how to navigate the system. And actually we had just moved to this country. So my children were relatively new in the education system. So she was identified in 3rd grade. And I understand that she was getting 2 pull-out classes, one for math and one for enrichment. Now I understand it's called enrichment. But back then I thought she was just, you know, she was enjoying it. So I really didn't know she was learning anything there. So anyway, so she comes home and tells me that that the teacher told her that she wouldn't be pulled out for the classes, and they had a name for those gifts, you know, for the program. And I said I was going to call the teacher because she was actually crying. And I called the teacher and I said, okay, my daughter says, well, you know, we are not pulling her out for this enrichment class. And she said, oh, we have funding cuts. So each, we only have students pulled out for one of the classes, and that my daughter was being pulled out for math because she's excellent in math. And so that was a good reason, you know, answer for me. So I told my daughter, I said, okay, this is what your teacher said. But my daughter, you know, said no, that her friend was being pulled out for both classes. And why is she not being pulled out? And I think what got me to actually calling the teacher back was that she said, Does it mean that I'm no longer smart? And I was thinking, what type of decision is making a third grader sort of start questioning her abilities? So I called up and this is not the classroom teacher, I was, is the gifted and talented program, director or whatever. That was the teacher that was providing these services for them. And then I said, okay, my daughter says that her friend is being pulled out for both. And the teacher said, oh yeah, there are a few students that have been pulled out for both classes, both types of classes. And I said, what is the criteria for determining who gets one pullout and who gets two? And immediately she said test scores. Okay. Well, it so happened that a few days or so before that I had received my daughter's third grade test scores. And that was way back then. I'm not good with numbers, no. And that was the first time I was actually reading, the test scores, and I was looking at this, and her line appeared to be in the, I think it was math 99% and reading 98. And I was trying to figure out, is it that she was at the top or at the bottom? So that was how I was. And I said, no, but, her teacher told me she was the best reader in her class. So she would probably be at the top of the, in the graph there. So back to the teacher, gifted and talented, I asked her, did you take a look at her test scores? I just received her test scores, and it looks as if she's scoring very high. And the teacher said, no. And then I said, okay, do you know that she is she's one age, she's below in age in her grade level? Because when we moved here, we sort of put her in the class that she was the next class for her from her grade in Nigeria. So when we figured out, that she was in an older grade, she was already doing well in school. So, and then I told the gifted and talented, do you know she's 1 year below her peers in her class? And the teacher said no. And then, basically that was the end of the conversation. She said she was going to get back to me. Well, she never got back to me, but my daughter came back the next day and told me she was so happy that she was put back into she was being pulled for both classes. And so all these years, and this happened many, many years ago, probably in the late 90s or 1990s or so. But since then, and when I started representing students from low-income families, my personal story has always brought up many questions in my mind. So what about children that don't have educated parents to call up the teacher and ask the right questions? What about students that don't even verbalize the difficulty or the learning problems that they're having in school? I was able to advocate for my child because she told me. But what about my daughter doesn't have behavioral issues, but what about students that do have some special education needs, but that may be gifted and that's not being addressed? So these are some of the questions that's been on my mind, and many more. And I'm so excited that probably we will have the opportunity to start having some of those discussions today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lilian. I appreciate sharing that story and kind of give some color on the challenges that families face and the amount of effort that it requires and calls, and actually having that confidence to do that. And kind of, a lot has changed in the last 20, 30 years since your experience, since my experience in gifted education. And so I think in this conversation, we'd like to kind of just get a little more background for our audience on how the system works, how students are identified, and kind of see where the conversation goes. For the audience, we welcome questions from you, generally on legislation, on underrepresented groups, on kind of those types of topics that you're interested in, and we'll try and weave it into the conversation when we can. For the panelists, let's start with maybe what's your relationship with gifted education? What's kind of your expertise in? Scott, you want to start?
Sure. So I got interested in gifted education kind of just based on a simple concept that, all students should have as close to an appropriately challenging and personally aligned learning experience as we can provide for them. That I think that should apply to all students. And that early on, kind of in my teaching career, I saw that it was, some of our most advanced students who were kind of being most ill-served. And that's kind of how I got interested in the field, especially those students who don't have kind of opportunity to have services provided, by their families because of socioeconomic capital or sociocultural capital. And so my focus has, I'm kind of a dual personality in that I'm an assessment person who's also interested in gifted ed. And because of that, I'm interested in identification and placement criteria. So I'm interested in researching and understanding how those placement criteria, like Lilian described, can be made more accurate, kind of just across the board, but of course, more accurate for the students they are most likely to miss. So, overall accuracy is important, but not also taking that second look and saying, okay, well, it might work for the average kid, but what about our students with disabilities or students who are recent immigrants or different groups? So both more accurate and also more equitable. And then I also like to think about it in terms of efficiency, because I don't want teachers spending any more time filling out forms than is absolutely necessary. I don't want the identification process to be measuring whether or not parents are, like Lilian said, whether or not parents are attorneys or professors or anything else, because I don't think that should be relevant. I think we should be measuring if kids need and require these services. So I want to get that kind of stuff out of the process. So I'm very much an identification person. I'm also interested in kind of like programming outcomes and whether or not these services actually provide learning benefits to students, because there is such a large, as I'm sure Wendy will talk about, and Joy as well, but there is such a large diversity of what gifted and talented programs and services can look like. It's almost a useless proper noun in the sense that these services can take any form you can probably imagine and often do, sometimes even within the same district. But the short answer is that I'm mostly an identification and assessment guy who's got a particular focus on equity.
You're perfect. Joy, you want to go next?
Yes. I have many years in the field of gifted education, and I've done pretty much everything anybody can do in this particular field, starting in the classroom as a classroom teacher, resource teacher for gifted students in a very small rural district, and then moving on to the state level. I was Wendy in the state of Virginia for 5 years. And I also worked with one of the very first JAVIS grants. I was a coordinator of a JAVIS grant, which actually served students from underrepresented populations, including students who had special education needs, but were not being identified and not being, noticed in their particular school districts. Students from poverty, students of color, from about 14 districts in the Commonwealth at the time. I was at the College of William and Mary, and that's where the grant had been funded for. And it was a 3-year grant, and it was a very rich experience for me as a newcomer to the field, because I learned so much about what this thing called gifted ed was all about. But I also learned so much about all of the inequities that existed then, the inequities that Scott mentioned that continue to exist. And it kept me motivated so that I could get into this field and try to do everything I could possibly do in any way I could to actually make a difference. And so one of the areas that I found would perhaps help a little bit more was the area of parent and family advocacy. Just as Lilian mentioned, as a parent, even though she was a highly educated parent, when her child was involved at the beginning in gifted ed as a 3rd grader, there was very little that she knew about what was going on in gifted education. So just imagine a parent of a child similar to Lilian's child who has less education, less access to resources, less time to communicate with school personnel, less understanding of the language of the field. We're like any other field. We have our own distinct language, not just the acronyms, but the language in gifted education is very broad and very distinct. And so parents don't understand what is the difference between an accelerated program as opposed to perhaps the enrichment or some type of a pull-out program. What does all this mean? What does all this mean? So as I started my studies at the master's degree level in particular, I focus on what do parents know and how can parents access the gifted ed change the way students are being served. And so I continue, Sarvesh, along that line. And so along with everything else that I've done and I'm continuing to do, I do think that one of the missing links in what we've been doing and over the years has been that we've not paid enough attention to family and parent engagement in gifted education. We just not paid enough attention. We haven't given the same type of resource dollars, if there are dollars. We haven't given enough attention. We haven't brought parents in enough. And when I say parents, I'm talking about all the parents, a representative sampling, perhaps, of parents to sit on these advisory councils so they can get to know, bring them in so we can learn better how to collaborate with them. Learn what all of these cultural differences are, or who are the persons within the community that can inform us and be agents for us so that we can learn more about who these children are. And so I've continued along that line, and as we mentioned earlier, I've written a lot, I've presented, and I continue to work with school districts and specialized programs because I think we've got a long, long way to go. And there's a great body of work that still needs to happen in this field. But again, I do want to point out that one of the areas that I think we've made very little progress, if any, is the area of family and parent engagement in gifted ed.
Thank you. And Wendy, we see you're from the Department of Education. Just tell us a little about your role and your connection to gifted education as well.
I'm really happy to do that. Before I begin, I do want to let you know how happy I am to have this opportunity and really welcome the collaboration between the groups of people, the lawyers who reached out to me and to others to have this conversation. So thank you. I've worked in gifted education for approximately 30 years, and I began as a district-wide coordinator for a district that had a commitment to education that was based on the idea that we should have something to meet the needs of gifted children. The idea was not fully formed, and I had, while I worked for the school district, the opportunity to shape services. But the longer I worked for the school district, the more I realized that I could do a great job working with gifted learners in my district, but outside of my district, everything remained the same. So when I would go to conferences, when I would speak with others, I realized that we needed change. We needed change in our state. And when a position opened at the Department of Education to be the gifted education specialist, I applied. I was so very excited, and I still am very honored to be in this position. When I think about gifted education, when I think about what matters most to me, certainly identification for services is a very foundational interest of mine. I'm interested in how kids move through the system, whether or not they have opportunities, what barriers might exist that keep them from reaching their highest potential. And I have an interest in both the acceleration of instruction and professional learning. But what I will tell you is that I think that that the idea of focusing solely on instruction is not the answer. And so I'm sure it will come out in this conversation, but it is the it is the intersection of not only of the instructional needs of a student, but also their social and emotional needs that allow us to move forward. So when I came to the department, my goal, lofty as it might be, was to make a difference on a greater scale. And we have that opportunity, each and every one of us, to work toward that ideal, making that difference. How does it happen? And what is my concern? What are my interests? I've told you about a few of them, but I think that what we need to do and talk about today is the intersection not only of identification of students for services, but the understanding of culture and what that does in terms of bias and what that does in terms of including or excluding students from services. So gives you a little bit of an idea of my background, of my interests. I'm just very happy to be here and have this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. I'd kind of like to bounce off the last point of yours with the next question. In terms of the significance of including a student into this gifted education program and the success that can give them through the rest of their education career and their life versus a potentially gifted student who who's excluded from the program, isn't put through this, and kind of the downsides that could have. Maybe Joy, if you could start on that one.
Yeah, again, this is a very purposeful field. We as you heard from Wendy and Scott's bios, their background, we very purposefully do this work every day because what our intention is that we provide more opportunities so that students who have the potential to participate in what we call higher level coursework, a more accelerated coursework, opportunities even outside of the school that will help enrich their learning experience, that those opportunities are present for them, so that we are going to work very, very hard to remove all the barriers that have been placed in front of these kids, because it's not about whether or not we know that these students exist. We've had enough experience, we've seen enough research, we've read about them, we know them in our communities, in our own families, among our colleagues. We know they exist. What oftentimes does not exist is access to the opportunities so that they can show who they are and what they're most interested in. And so absolutely, this field is a field that has great potential to change the course of education for so many students that come to our schools every single day, into our public school setting, who without the gifted education programming models that we have in place would not ever be able to see the success that they could see had they not been involved in gifted education courses. The courses, the programming, again, I've seen and I've evaluated programs and been involved and read and consulted and even trained people that oftentimes will say, this is going to make the difference, or they tell stories about how gifted education made a difference in their own lives, how being a part of a program where they were able to learn and to work harder, to think harder, and then also to be with a group of peers. So the peer group process, the peer groups or the cohorts that these students come along with are also very important. We know that all children want friends, they want peers who think like them, who look like them, have the same kind of interests that they have. And so in gifted education classes and programs, this is where many of our students find what they say their home or their tribe, their people, because they're with these other kids and they don't feel so different any longer, because these other ones, that they think like them, they have ideas, they have, visions for the future, where they, even as a young person, can make a difference in so many, many aspects of our lives as humans. And so we know, and we work hard for this, very, very hard, to, again, remove those barriers so that gifted education services can have a profound impact on the student's future. Without these services, I'm not suggesting that all students who are bright would utterly fail without gifted education, but I do say that there are many of them who have been able to succeed and excel in areas because they've been involved in gifted education programs from the time that they were in elementary school, through middle, through secondary, going on to early college. You know, we hear great stories every day about children who are 12 and 14 and 15 going on to early college and, you know, taking credits even as early as their middle school years that will allow them to excel and move more quickly through a undergraduate program because they were involved in accelerated courses in gifted education. They had experiences. They were with teachers who respected and understood who they were. They didn't have to stop asking all the questions that they tend to ask a lot. They didn't have to stop, you know, being curious and stop being, you know, the inventive one, but they were encouraged to be inventive. They were encouraged to be curious. And so this program area, even though we don't have the federal guidelines or the federal, you know, dollars to go into each of our districts, we don't have the laws. We those of us involved in this field truly believe, and I think I can speak I know I can speak for Wendy and Scott. We believe that this does make a difference. It does make a difference. And like Lilian, I've had children of my own who've gone through gifted education. I saw the difference, and then I saw when they were not engaged. I've known, you know, again, and now I'm a nana. And so I'm watching and looking at these young ones, these babies, as they go through, when they're being accelerated or when they're being challenged. And then what happens when they're not? When they're not challenged. And so, and then also watching again to see where advocacy is most needed and who else should be a part of that advocacy team. And yes, I am totally convinced that with the right kinds of services, the right kinds of advocates, the right kinds of dollars, and the persons, you know, who necessarily need to be committed to this, and that's school administrators too. The gifted education does make a difference in the path, in a child's path in their education.
Yeah, I appreciate that answer, especially just given that peer group. I think is very important that it's not in that group. It's cool to like math and reading versus being made fun of. Scott or Wendy, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, I'll just tell a quick kind of example of everything that Joy was just describing. There's a paper that's under review right now, but it studied a gifted and talented program in Florida, kind of a very rigorously designed and evaluated paper. And one of the things that it found is this is specifically looking at college going, which is not an outcome we often look at in terms of gifted programs. You know, a fifth grade gifted program, why would you look at college attendance? But this paper actually found that, I think it was fourth and fifth grade gifted and talented program placement. It had a pretty significant effect on the college going behavior, specifically of boys of color. It didn't have that big of an effect on white students because they were already going to college at pretty high rates. But this was a district that is predominantly, vastly made up of students of color. It's a very large, one of the largest districts in the country. And the pictures in my head, I can't, they're not my pictures, I can't share them, but the picture in my head is pretty compelling. The increased rate of college attendance, kind of a causal effect due to much earlier gifted and talented placement. And the only thing that the authors have been talking to them have hypothesized is that it's, again, this idea of these students never necessarily saw themselves as, you know, college material, as smart kids, as gifted kids, but that being identified as gifted, being called out in that way, and then being able to interact with a peer group in that way gave them that kind of sense of self that they thought, wow, you know, maybe this is for me. So I bring it up just because it's such a kind of a great example of everything that Joy was just talking about.
And if I may jump in here, obviously, I believe in the impact of gifted education. But I think that when we take a look at what happens to kids as they move through the system, some kids are disappointed. And I say this and I feel sad about it, but the truth of the matter is every year we have children who enter kindergarten. They know 50% of what's going to be provided to them in the way of instruction, and much more. In fact, we also know that there are kids that enter every grade that are curious and interested. And if we don't support that, if we don't continue to develop that interest, what we end up with are kids that think that it doesn't matter, that school is important. And why is that important? Because oftentimes, unfortunately, we find that there are many gifted and talented programs that are based solely, or at least a great deal of the process for identifying a student is based on what teachers observe. And if we don't know what we're looking at, it's very difficult to support and continue to engage and motivate students. Students don't drop out when they're 13 or 15 or 17. They start dropping out much earlier than that. And sadly, we know that there are a lot of very bright students who do drop out for a variety of reasons. And they may be still physically in the classroom, but you and I both know that they've stopped listening. They've stopped caring. And that's something we certainly want to avoid. Every child deserves a challenging and appropriate education. And I think to figure out who those kids are puts the onus once again back on the school system, back on those of us who are involved in identification of students for services. We need systems to identify students that allow us to find those students before they begin to mentally or physically drop out of school. We know that the impact, as Scott says, is very long-reaching. Scott's study the study he referenced is very interesting, but it goes even farther. If we get kids who are not challenging themselves or challenged at the appropriate levels in elementary school, by the time they're in middle school, they don't have the study skills that they need to continue on as new information is presented to them. They've been deprived of that connection between work and success. They've been deprived of that effort, of that joy of learning. But when we go even farther and take a closer look, a student who is not doing well or has average grades in math in elementary school is not likely to be put in an accelerated math class when they're in middle school. That accelerated math class in middle school is often the pathway into accelerated coursework in math when they get to high school. And if the students are not on that pathway, it makes it very difficult for them to have the opportunity to take as many science courses as they would like. It makes it difficult for them to get into the professions that they would like at some point in time, because they haven't gotten into the schools based on what they've been provided with in early education. So it's interesting that we need to note that those pathways start early. Now, there are some really interesting articles that have come out recently about taking a closer look at student testing, not necessarily grades in the classroom, but assessment, and then placing students automatically in those high-level courses based on their achievement. Now, people call that auto enrollment. It certainly has a great potential for some students, but what about some of our other students? And I think that I think that every single person in this that's part of this panel has alluded and talked about in some detail the fact that we have kids that are left out for a lot of reasons. We want to make sure that the kids without advocates are able to move forward. The kids who are English language learners may need some special assistance. the kids who are in special education but gifted may need some special assistance. We have to have somehow pathways that provide students with all of those opportunities. We have to figure out what the barriers are and address them early on.
Yeah, I agree. Just to expand on that a little bit, how, I know in each state, each potentially district is kind of different, but in Minnesota, how are children identified as gifted right now? Then is it generally like, hey, you're either gifted or not gifted? Or I know there's also things about like talent domains and asynchronous learning, like Lilian kind of mentioned, you're really good at math, or maybe you're really good at reading. How does the current system figure that out? And is there maybe a best practice that we should be moving towards?
Sarvesh, I'm going to assume that question
Yeah.
is to me.
Yeah.
And for better or for worse, and I say that tongue in cheek, but it really is for better or for worse, identification of students for services is determined at the local level. And
How
it
local?
is how local?
Yeah.
At the district level. And in some school districts, we see different practices in different buildings. So that's an issue that we need as a profession, as a state, to think about. What are we doing and who's making those decisions, and why are those decisions? What's influencing those decisions? Lilian talked about, in Lilian's story, she tells us about somebody who was kept out of services, or at least it appeared to be that they were going to lose the ability to participate based on an economic decision. And sadly, that happens often. And one of the things that our school districts talk about frequently is, do they have the capacity? Do they have enough people to do the work? And the reality is, we should not identify students for anything we can't provide. We don't want to waste their time. We don't want to waste the resources of the school district. So in my perfect world, one of the things that we'd be thinking about is, how can we work harder to more individualize how kids are assessed, so that we know specifically what kids need. Now, in some districts, and frankly, the history of gifted education is steeped in large numbers of districts identifying students based on a teacher's observation. And teacher observation isn't a bad thing, but we can't use that as the sole reason, because that assumes that the teacher knows all. That assumes that the teacher has had a high level of training, and that the teacher has all the information in front of them. And rarely do they have all those pieces. So sometimes, even in the most well-intentioned schools, we have teachers as barriers. So we need to have a multiple, and this is something we talk about frequently at the state level, is schools need to have multiple pieces of information in order to identify students for services, in order to identify them for the correct type of service. And our field is evolving. We are moving away from talking about a gifted student to saying that a student is gifted, or a student is talented in a particular area. It's a much more inclusive way of thinking about gifted education. But in Minnesota, like so very many states in our country, we have a definition of gifted, but our school districts have the ability to select their own, and they have the ability to determine whether or not to serve students and how to identify them, as well as how to evaluate their systems. So there's a lot of local control. And as I said, it's the good news and the bad news. The good news is that it means that a district can assuming that they have the appropriate level of resources, select a system that is appropriate for their populations. And it is inclusive of all the different types of cultures within their area. But the bad news is that's not always the case. And so we rely heavily on professional learning opportunities to help guide what's going on in our district. Fortunately, we have a lot of very talented people in the state of Minnesota, and we have a large number of coordinators working in schools to do the right thing, to identify students. What they could use more of are additional resources. And what they could use more of is support in terms of how do we universally screen students. And that's an idea that I'm hoping we'll get into as we move a little further into our conversation.
And does the Department of Education track how these different school districts are doing their screenings?
That's a very interesting question. Our schools are not required by law to provide their identification procedures to the state. I do have a lot of that information based on interaction with coordinators and taking a look at people's websites. So we don't have an official figure that Scott would find valid, but what we do have is some sort of other information that we find to be of interest. But like I said, we do not collect that. And one of the reasons we don't collect that, to be honest, is that not all school districts have had formalized gifted programs. Now, our most recent legislation expands the idea of specific programs to programs and services, which now is more inclusive of our smaller school districts who are doing great work without having formalized programs.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. And enjoy your experience in Virginia, especially in a rural town. Is it similar or different?
When I was Wendy in Virginia, our system was quite different, and it remains different to this day. In Virginia, we do have a state mandate for gifted services. Each school district is required to submit a report which sets out what their criteria are, what the program of services looks like. And we use that terminology services many years ago. Back in the 90s is when we first started using that terminology around services instead of just students. And so we would give to the school district in the template, the local plan template, we will give to them some options that they should be able to say, these are the kinds of services that we are providing for our students based upon the criteria that we utilize for identification protocol, which also, as early as the 90s, was a multiple criteria protocol. So meaning that we could not utilize just one test score or one check sheet or one set of grades to identify gifted students, but we had to use multiple sources. And so that remains to this day, where I still see the limitation, however, is that what happens is that even though the localities have these plans and they submit the plans and they go through what's called a peer review process to kind of check out that everybody has met all of what the legislature says should be met within that plan document. What we don't do, and we cannot do, is because of the way that the laws are set up, is that nobody at the state level can actually say yay or nay. We can say your plan looks good, or you have to add this to your plan, but very seldom is the school district's funds withheld because their plan is not being submitted on time, or it is not appropriate according to the template. And then there's guidance for localities by the person who holds the role of the state level coordinator for K-12 programs. There is guidance, but again, there's no mandate, or there's no withdrawing or withholding of funding. And so, you know, we know what the criteria are. We do use the terminology around gifted services, which is good. But we also emphasize underrepresented populations and inclusivity, making sure that school districts are setting aside that knowledge and that documentation in their plans. So, you know, we're proud of those gains that we've made in Virginia, but we also know that even with all that, we still have a number of school districts that are not equitably identifying students, you know, by race, by income level. We know that a number of students are not able to access what we call our state governing schools programs, because they haven't had access earlier, as Wendy talked about, to the early high-level content in elementary and middle school, and so they're not as competitive at the high school level. So you know, we still have our issues here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, but I am pleased that we, you know, were able to, a number of years, move away from just gifted education to gifted services, and also ensure that school districts were using multiple criteria to identify students within their program, within their school districts. And as Wendy said, ensuring that when you've identified students, you also have a set of services that match the needs of that student, and not vice versa, that we're identifying students and then we don't have anything for them. So, you know, that's it's kind of like juggling, but we have to make sure that happens as well. But it's not all perfect, either.
Yeah. And Scott, you shared that chart earlier that kind of shows the kind of underrepresentation, especially of Black students, Latinx students, and Native students. Are there some states that you're seeing the data that are doing it a little bit better? Is there a way to make things a little more equitable and accessible for everybody?
The answer is yes to both, but a slightly different answer. So there are states that have better, more proportional representation of students from different groups. There's a wide variability, but it's easier to identify which states look better than to identify why they look better. And I'll just give you an example. On paper, West Virginia looks just amazing for students with disabilities. No, English learners. It's English learners. And that's because there's like 400 English learners in the state of West Virginia. So, you know, the numbers can look, you know, when your denominator gets small, things start to get kind of crazy. So, but we have started to see some interesting things. So that's the answer to the first question. And the answer to the second question is, you know, in terms of like what is it doing it better? Who's doing it better? We are seeing some kind of interesting things. So specifically for English learners, for whatever reason, there's about, if you take the top 5% of schools nationally, so the 5% of schools that are just have the highest rates of identification of English learners, those are schools where English learners are twice as represented and gifted as they are in the student population, which is just crazy. Like, that's really unheard of. Not crazy because it shouldn't happen, crazy because it's unusual. For whatever reason, about a third of them are in Texas. And I don't know why. It's not because Texas has a lot of Latinos, you know, New Mexico, California have lots of Latinos. It's not because Texas has a lot of English learners. Alaska actually has more English learners. So we can't exactly pin down what they're doing in terms of state policies. There are, you know, things like state mandates that have been shown to have a pretty positive effect on equity. So if you take an average school and take it out of Illinois, where there is no mandate, there's no nothing, and plop it in a state like North Carolina or Virginia, you see probably something in the range of a 25% percentage point increase in that school's equity. So having a mandate and just requiring schools to actually do this identification, this is correlation, of course, is correlated with quite a bit better equity. So there definitely are practices, both at policy level kind of practices, and also individual school practices. I know Joy talked about those a little bit, and this is something I know Wendy talks about a lot as well. Perhaps the biggest one, and I guess my favorite or go-to school level practice is, instead of waiting for some kind of teacher referral, parent phone call, parent advocacy before you even start the conversation about advanced learning opportunities, schools that proactively seek kids out, surprise, surprise, have more of them, identify more of them, and identify more of them from more groups. And so just to paint a real concrete picture of this, if instead of not considering kids for gifted services until they're referred by a teacher, you proactively every year look at your data, and that data can be really diverse types of data. It doesn't mean just standardized tests, but look at your data for any kind of signal that a student might be under challenged. So it goes from being reactive, which very often requires, a parental intervention, to proactive and saying, okay, I got my data in front of me. Do any of these kids look like they might be under challenged? I think too often, especially the schools that have large populations of students of color, don't look at their data that way. They don't look at it from the standpoint of who might be under challenged.
Exactly.
That kind of strengths-based mindset. Too often it's, which one of my students are remedial. We have to make sure that kind of all schools are always looking for kids who could do more, not just, kids who are struggling readers or, whatever else. So kind of a long answer, but there definitely are successful schools out there. There are schools that are identifying 2 or 3 times as many students of color for gifted as they are in their general population. But they certainly are outliers.
And with the states that are mandating, and kind of maybe in Minnesota and Virginia as well, there's a question from the audience, is there funding as well? Is that funding do all schools get the funding? Is it on a per student who's identified basis? Is it per student population basis? How does it work?
I can
Anybody
answer
jump in?
that. Having taken a look at the state of the states, which is the most recent collection of data on gifted education programming in the United States, I believe that 27 states currently provide funding for gifted and talented education. Minnesota, fortunately, is one of those. In our state, it is $13 per adjusted marginal pupil unit, which is education speak for the weighting in terms of WEIGHTING weight that is given towards students that are in specific grade levels. So it is $13 times that marginal adjusted marginal per pupil unit for all of the schools in the district. So it's not dependent on who is identified, but is dependent on the full population of the school district. And I'm really proud to say that those funds have been in place for over 20 years. So they've been stable. They're important. And what's interesting about our funding in the state of Minnesota is that it's restricted. So it can't be thrown into the general fund. It can only be spent to identify students for services, to provide programs or services in any way. And the third, also interesting in the state of Minnesota, is to provide staff development so that staff understand the unique social, emotional, and instructional needs of gifted learners. So that funding can only be spent that way. And that funding must be carried over if for some reason a school district doesn't spend all their money or any of their money, that money still remains restricted for gifted education use. The funding across the country is a fascinating topic. And some of the states that we know of would surprise you by the amount of funding that they provide, whether it's large or small. But the one thing that we do know is that when there is funding in place, when we do have the opportunity to restrict how funding is spent, gifted services follow and become a part of the school's plan for excellence.
Okay, thank you for that. Joy earlier had mentioned kind of the differences in accelerated learning versus enrichment program, and I know there's also AP in high school. Do all of these fall under the category of gifted education? Could you maybe expand a little bit on the differences and kind of how the curriculum looks like in different schools?
Again, gifted education is so broad and so diverse. Again, it really depends upon the locality. It depends upon the type of training that school personnel have and the emphasis that they really want to place on the variety of services that they would like to have made available to the gifted students or the students that they identify. And so, yes, there are a wide range of services, everything from pull-out programs, which means that a student will be in a regular classroom for the majority of the school week and say for 2 to 3 hours of the week, which is very limited, but maybe 2 to 3 hours of that week, they will be taken out of their regular classroom into another space to work with other gifted students around a particular content in a particular subject matter area, or maybe problem solving. We do what's called project-based learning or problem-based learning. And then they would also have opportunities as they get older, going into middle school, to be involved in accelerated courses. And some school districts also encourage, and we would like to encourage this as well, is that students have the opportunity to have acceleration, grade level acceleration in particular, as early as early childhood, because we know, as Wendy said earlier, many of these students come to school very, very capable, very advanced. They come to school just as they are, and they are so ready and so excited about learning that we know that when we do early childhood development and we look at those gifted learners, that we have an opportunity then to start what's called an early and sustained engagement and high academic learning. And so it's really a good thing for school districts to do that. But at the same time, we know that doesn't happen often. In many of our school districts, identification begins at 2nd grade, maybe at 3rd grade, sometimes even as late as 4th grade. But we do encourage early identification and acceleration for students as early as the early childhood years. There's conflict and discussion around that area, but we do know that when those students are involved and engaged and they have the opportunity to move ahead, and that's what acceleration is basically. We used to call it grade skipping back in the day, but it's basically the same thing. You know, the kid who gets a chance to go from 2nd grade to 4th grade, but then it requires long-term planning also. So what happens when they get to 4th grade? So what happens when they get to 5th grade? And so it does require long-term planning. It requires personnel who understand what their academic, intellectual, and their social emotional needs are as they move through their schooling. But yes, we know we have many opportunities in our school districts across the country. Sometimes students are cluster grouped. And there's been argument about cluster grouping for years. So there's students that are cluster groups, say 5 to 7 students who've been identified, and they're all in the same group, same class together, and they move along as a cohort. Again, that provides for them the peer grouping. It provides for the school district a way of managing perhaps that smaller group of students and providing 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 teachers to work who have specialized training. And so, you know, when we talk about gifted education, sometimes we use the label of gifted education, gifted and talented education. Some school districts are now using terminology like advanced education or advanced learning programming, and so that we can encompass any of the types of services that could be made available to our brighter students, but could be made available and being made available, again, 2 different things. And that's why we're in the quagmire that we're in around identification and equity, is because these services may be available, but all the students who should have access to the services don't always have access. And so it's constantly a struggle, for us to make sure that we remove the barriers, that we put in place practices, like Scott mentioned earlier, universal screening that will allow us to do so much more with our students and so much sooner, and engage students at an earlier level in terms of who they can be involved with, and when can they find their peers. But we as a field, we really have to work together more to ensure that rather than having so many different ways of identifying ourselves, maybe we can narrow that down a bit more and service the students that we know we should be servicing. I hope that's not too convoluted of response, but
No, that's great.
yeah, but yes, it is gifted ed, it's talent development, it's advanced learner education. I was in a school district once, and my title changed 3 times in 4 years, and I was the lead person, but my title changed 3 times. And I was like, okay, as long as you allow me to continue doing what I'm doing, and I'm making an effort to work more closely with the Title I schools, utilize the universal screening tool that was already in place, you allow me to do that. You can change the title as much as you want. I just want to make sure we're going to get a chance to work with these students and to bring the students into these spaces where they can have the acceleration that they need in order to grow and develop. But it has a wide range of titles.
Yeah. I know a lot of this conversation has been about identification, what schools can do. I know we have a lot of interested parents here in the audience. What can parents do to help in this identification process? Is there some objective screening or something that parents can get involved in? Hey, Wendy, if you want to take that one.
Sure. Again, it depends on the school district. I think that there are a lot of school districts that accept parent requests for some sort of screening or identification. There are also some school districts that have parents fill out information about their child. I know that as a teacher and an educator that I would always ask at the beginning of the year, what would you like me to know about your child? That was my open-ended question to parents, so that they were able to tell me everything they wanted me to know, what I should know. But the truth of the matter is, advocacy remains really, really important, not just for our own children, but also for other children. When I first became involved personally as a parent on a task force that was discussing gifted education, reviewing the options, I remember how important it was for me to talk globally, not just about my own child, but what do children need? What do we need to, what do we believe? What is in our vision? What are the goals that we would hope for kids? But I also think that parents being involved is incredibly important. Being an advocate, talking at conferences with your child's classroom teacher. But if something comes up beforehand, absolutely contact your school, contact your classroom, but always keep in mind that your child is one of maybe 28, 32, whatever, within a classroom. So it's really important to understand that you may not get an answer immediately, but alerting your child's teacher to an issue or a concern that you have is not only always appropriate, but really, I think it's part of a parent's job description. Unfortunately, we have a lot of parents who don't feel empowered to speak on behalf of their child. And that's something that we need to encourage. We need to do that as a school district. We need to give them opportunities at a variety of times of day, at a variety of modes of communication, whether it's a note, an email, an opportunity to come and talk with your teacher at a particular time of day, a survey that the school sends out. We need to make a concerted effort. At MDE, we have several specialists that are community outreach specialists. And one of the things that they spend a lot of their time doing is communicating with the families of, frankly, people that are new to this country, whether they are migrants, whether they've been here for a long time, that are still English language learners. We need to make certain that all families feel comfortable advocating for their child.
Okay, great, thank you. I have many more questions, but I think we might be out of our time on the Q&A session. I'd like to just open it up for maybe some closing remarks, and then we also have a lot of attorneys here on the line. And like I said, WILD's mission is to provide some opportunities for direct support and partnership. I know there's some people in the audience that are looking for ways to get involved. So if you have opportunities for people to get involved, local nonprofits, I think are on asking as well. Because could kind of relay that along with their closing remarks. Scott, you want to start on that one?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back a little bit to something that both Joy and Wendy were just talking about, because this conversation is, is really about advocacy for students of color specifically, but all students who are underrepresented in these kinds of programs. Is one of the big things I would encourage a parent or any kind of advocate, even if you're an attorney who just happens to have a relationship with a school, is a lot of times when we're talking about equity and proportional enrollment and access to these programs, the conversation turns to the criteria that we're using. And that's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The question I want to encourage everyone to be asking of the districts or of the schools is access to the service being conditioned on something that is relevant to success or irrelevant? And so just to give you an example, we don't put all kids in AP Calc BC, in 10th grade, because it wouldn't make any sense. The vast majority of students would fail at that. I would fail miserably at that. And I do statistics full time. We don't start third graders in kindergarten for the most part. Why do we do that? Because in general, we think that they're probably not ready for it yet. They're not developmentally appropriate. There's nothing wrong, with having placement criteria for specific services. We do it with students with disabilities all the time. We do it with English learners. There's nothing inherently wrong with that, as long as those criteria are appropriate and relevant and defensible. Gifted education has a long history of conditioning access on things that aren't relevant. So do you have a parent that's willing to come and yell at the superintendent? Like I would be comfortable yelling at the superintendent. That's not relevant, So whether you are a parent, whether you are just an advocate, asking that question of, okay, I see that my child isn't identified, like Lilian, or I see that our recent immigrant students, like our recent Somali immigrant students, say outside Minneapolis, are not very well represented in this math class. Let's talk about why that is. What are the criteria? And then have the conversation about, are those criteria relevant to the service? Is the service algebra and the students are not being placed because they haven't learned pre-algebra skills yet? That's, I think, often a more kind of, I want to say productive, because that makes it seem like the other conversations aren't productive, but that's often just a better way to start, because again, there are lots of criteria that are appropriate. There are also lots of criteria, especially in gifted ed, that are just not appropriate. And so I think sometimes that can make the conversations between a parent or an advocate and a district a little bit more comfortable, a little less combative, and also just more productive from the standpoint of how do we make sure that we're putting kids in the program or in the service who are ready and would benefit from it, and not keeping them out because they couldn't afford test prep, or they don't understand what a bubble sheet is because 6 weeks ago they lived in a different country or something like that. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I would really encourage advocates to do.
Before we leave that subject, Sarvesh, I want to just kind of piggyback on Scott and Wendy's comments about parents and parent engagement and helping parents better understand what schooling is all about. But in particular, again, what is this thing called gifted education all about? And I'd just like to encourage the school districts, local school personnel, administrators, oftentimes we hear that there are certain parent groups or certain communities that are not as engaged. They don't have the information, so they don't get engaged, or we don't have meetings at the right time and all that. But I would like to put the onus back on the school district to engage these parents, to find out ways that they can engage these parents, to find out ways, remove the barriers, and then step into the world of these parents perhaps and bring them in, you know, or go out into their world, go out into their community groups, to their community centers. Be sure that the material and the information that you share around what gifted services is all about are shared in the school district, in the community, in the same way that it's shared in the school district. You know, we have to do more. If we want to have people to be more engaged, we have to do more. And if we try one strategy or two strategies for 5 or 10 years and it didn't work, then that means we have to try something new now so that it will work. Again, our communities are becoming more and more diverse, but even for communities that were here all along, you know, what has the school district's role been in terms of teaching families and engaging families in advocacy and collaboration? You know, what have we listened to these families? Have we heard, you know, their stories? Have we, for example, we started this session today with Lilian's story, which was a great place to start because that made the whole conversation more real. It brought it right back down to where it belonged, and that was where all of us are. And it's really important for school personnel to not have perceptions and, you know, misconceptions about communities. They have to know what the community is about. And if they don't know, then somebody knows that community needs to be brought in and be an agent for that community. And again, that's a part of the work that I've spent a lot of time on. I've been to school districts all across this country and share with them what kinds of strategies they can use. And the more we start using some of these strategies, the larger and larger the family engagement group becomes, the larger and larger the workshop session participants become. You know, when we start figuring out different ways of engaging and making sure that people have the information they need, they cannot make good decisions about the services that we provide if they don't understand what the services are. And that has nothing to do with the family's intelligence. It has more to do with their access to information, the same as having students have access to the services. So again, we need to focus more attention on that. And if it hasn't worked one way, let's try some other strategies to engage families differently and to help them become a stronger part of this whole boat, this big ship we're riding along on called gifted education. So we need the people, we need them to be a part of that, but they won't be if they don't feel like they belong, don't feel like it belongs to them, that they haven't been welcomed, that there's nobody around that looks like them. So there's a lot of things we have to think about. We have to be more humane in our thinking and creative in our thinking as well. But again, I didn't say this earlier, but I do want to say thank you to your organization for this conversation and for having the backing of what's going on in Minnesota's gifted education services. I think it's very important to have this kind of collaboration. And I thank you for allowing me to be a part of the conversation.
Thanks, Ray.
Sarvesh, before we move on, may I respond? There are a couple of things that I really want to talk about today. And one of those things is that, I'll just be honest, the thing that keeps me up at night, the thing that I worry about most, frankly, are the students that we're missing. And I agree wholeheartedly with the information that Joy has so passionately presented about the importance of making parents feel welcome and the importance of reaching out. But I worry about the kids that are in foster care, the kids who don't have advocates, the kids who are new to this country, whose parents don't understand that they have an opportunity, they have the right to say something about their child's education. I worry about people who are uninformed, kids for a variety of reasons. And for that reason, I think that we really need to take a very, very close look at the potential of universal screening. And universal screening is a very intentional assessment of children at approximately the same age, the same grade, several times in their educational career. And what it does is it levels the playing field, depending on the tool. We hope that it does. And it allows us to then take a closer look at some students. Some kids are quiet for a lot of reasons, culture included. A lot of children will not make eye contact, will not raise their hand, will not engage. There are also a lot of kids that are trying to be under the radar. There are so many reasons why children don't always catch our eye. We cannot rely on that. We can hope for it, but we cannot rely on it. So universal screening in itself is incredibly important. This opportunity to assess all children, for instance, in the grades of 2, 4, and 6. An opportunity to take a look at them and to look for their relative strengths. I'm interested in strengths. It also allows us to look for areas where students might need some additional support in order to raise their achievement in a particular area. It might help us in a variety of areas, but we do know universal screening has been shown time and time again to make a big impact on who is noticed and who is provided with additional levels of screening to get into a gifted and talented program. One of the things that we need to be really aware of, though, is that we need to use local norms. So we're comparing children with other children who've had similar experience, exposure. That gets a little difficult when we talk about some of the ways in which our students are diverse. But by the same token, it's a step in the right direction. We can't use national norms. We have to use local norms. And sometimes what we really need to use are building norms. We need systems of identification that are allowing us to take a look at all students and flexible enough to modify our expectation in order to take a closer look at some students who have had different types of experiences. So it's not a one size fits all, because all of our kids are different from each other. And I think we heard it earlier, if you know one gifted child, you know one gifted child. So let's take a close look at what can we do, what systems can be in place in order for us to have universal screening in our state. And we do have a lot of school districts that do it, but not enough. We need help.
Right. Thanks for that, Wendy. We're just at time here. I think thanks everybody. Linda Zhang's our WILD program manager. She has a few closing remarks as well.
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Lilian Zhang. I'm the program manager for WILD. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have a couple of call to actions for our audience members. I know there are questions in the chat about how to stay involved and get involved on this issue. So for our attorneys in the audience, SMRLS is always looking for volunteer attorneys in this area, and they provide training in various areas of education law. And once you feel comfortable, you can take on cases of your own. And ELAP has cases such as helping exceptional students with getting appropriate IEP, and they have services that address their gifts and talents. You can email Laura if you're interested and want to learn more about how to get involved with the SMRLS ELAP. Call to action to the general population is stay connected with WILD. So the WILD education team, which includes our moderator Sarvesh, will continue to investigate ways on how to further support solutions for making gifted education more equitable and accessible, join our mailing list to learn of upcoming programs and volunteer opportunities around this issue. And the easiest thing to do is to continue this conversation. Today's program will be available on YouTube in the coming days. You can share this information with parents and families who have children in the K-12 school system. We will also send a follow-up email to all the attendees, to folks who've registered for this program, with resources on gifted education, the chat Q&A, and then more about the amazing advocacy that academics and parents are doing for gifted education. And lastly, I just wanted to say thank you to SMRLS for co-hosting this forum with us. Thank you to Lilian and Laura from ELAP, who are instrumental in the development of this program. Thank you, Sarvesh, for moderating this, the conversation today. Thank you to Sophia, who's the WILD program assistant, for helping us put this program together, and the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon on an issue that not a lot of us are aware about. I hope that y'all continue talking about the issue and ways in which we can improve gifted education. That's all we have for y'all. Thank you so much. And if you enjoy programming like this and would like to see more, please consider making a contribution to WILD. SMRLS also accepts donations as well. We'll drop all of those links in the chat for everyone. Thank you.